In this video, we'll talk about the architecture of Crystal Reports for Visual Studio.net. And just to let you know that this is a PowerPoint presentation primarily, however, there will be elements of Visual Studio included in here. Let's get at the heart of what Crystal Reports for Visual Studio.net is. I mean, what is it really? Ultimately, it's about four things. It's a set of tightly integrated add-ins, toolbars, and designers that fit into Visual Studio.net. The Crystal Reports team worked closely with Visual Studio developers as they were designing this in Redmond. Then there's also an element of the old Crystal Reports 8.0, the COM-based engine. I anticipate in further releases that it'll be converted over to 100% managed code, but for right now there's some interop that happens. And as you see the next point, there's a .NET wrapper around the COM-based engine, which we know as the crystaldecisions.crystalreports.engine namespace. And whenever we're developing using the report document, we basically have access to this .NET wrapper. And then finally, it's a series of .NET components that know how to display the reports. There's a Windows and a web-based viewer. So let's take a look at the architecture of the components that are involved with Crystal Reports for Visual Studio.net. First of all, like we said, at its core, there's the CRPE32, which is the COM-based engine. This is really the brains of the operation. It knows how to integrate the database results. It knows how to generate the RPT files, charting, exporting. Everything that is fundamental to Crystal Reports happens on the COM-based engine. And therefore, to be used in .NET, they need to develop a wrapper, which is the next part. It's the crystaldecisions.crystalreports.engine assembly namespace. And when you develop your applications, you have access to this namespace using the report document object. So when you add a new report document to your application, you grab it from the toolbar and drag and drop it onto the designer surface, whether it's the web-based or the Windows-based form designer. It does a couple of things at that point. As we'll see in a moment, I'll demonstrate this. But essentially what it does is it gives you the ability to access the engine so that you can change anything you want to about the report itself. And I think that this is a good part to make this point, that there's a fundamental difference between the report and the viewers. And you use a different set of objects and namespaces to manage the report and change everything you want to about the report. And then there's a different set of objects and namespaces that handle the display of that report and the navigation through that report. And we'll make that point again in just a few moments. The crystaldecisions.crystalreports.reportsource namespace is something that you won't deal with directly, but basically it manages the communication between the viewers and the report engine. And so this allows you to have the viewers on a separate machine than the actual report engine, allowing for things like the web services or fat client applications where you have Windows Form application sitting on a client's desktop that's able to access the reports off of a main server. And then finally you have the viewers. They know how to interpret the actual compiled report that's in a specialized format called EPF, and they know how to render that correctly for their given venue, whether it's a Windows Form application or for the web. And we'll talk about the object model of these viewers in just a moment. And then there's actually one other namespace, the crystaldecisions.crystalreports.shared namespace, and it has interface definitions and helper functions and things that will be used by both the engine and the viewers themselves. So we talked a couple times already about the report document object and how important that was, because it gives you the access point into the engine namespace. So what's happening behind the scenes whenever you create a report and then add a report document object onto your designer surface? So what I've done is I've taken the liberty of just creating a quick little application, a test bed for all my development, and what I've got here is a report that I created called Crystal Report 3, and it's just a simple report that I developed using the experts. And I want you to notice the first thing that happens whenever you create a report. There's actually a code behind for that report. You could even drill down further and see that it has a resource file. If you were to double-click this report 3.vb, you'd see kind of a designer surface, and when you switch to the code view, you can actually see what's going on behind the scenes. Crystal Reports is creating a public class that allows you to access certain properties. For example, it sets the resource name to the name of the report, and then it also has something interesting, read-only properties for each of the sections that you defined within the report. So when you see a section over here in the report, let's say, like, for example, the report header section 1, the code behind gives you the ability to get to section 1 by making it a read-only property. And so this is what it means by creating strongly typed reports. Reports that you're able to reference the various objects on the report by their name, not by using kind of the nomenclature that they have here. This is very similar to strongly typed data sets in the ADO.NET world, where you can access the tables by name and the fields by name instead of having to use, tables sub-zero dot field or column sub-3. And so I'll show you how that plays in just a moment. But let's go to, close all this down, and go to our just a regular form designer. When I go to my toolbox, go to components, and plop a report document object onto the designer surface, it pops up this little message box and asks us whether we want to use a typed or untyped class for the basis of this report document. And so it shows us a list of all of our typed, or rather strongly typed reports, or we can select an untyped report document. So I'm just going to select Crystal Report 3, since that's the one we were looking at, and select OK. So notice that it puts an instance of the Crystal Report 3 onto our designer surface. So if I were to go into my form load and take a look at some of the hidden designer code, we can scroll down and take a look at the initialized component private sub, where all of the settings are made on the objects that are contained by the form. And we can take a look at this first line, me.crystalreport31 equals a new instance of salesreport.crystalreport3. There is our strongly typed report. It's an instance of this. So that now whenever you refer to Crystal Report 3.1, such as here, you can set the print options, and we can also get a reference to it here. So if we go Crystal Report 3.1 dot, now we can see all of the properties and methods that we get access to. And I'll show you what it means to have a strongly typed report. As we scroll down, you can see that we have our sections. So I'm going to go ahead and type in section 1 dot, and now I can retrieve the name or the format and set all of this information at runtime from within my code. So you can see here that the Crystal Reports for Visual Studio.NET is pretty extensible. In fact, you could develop an entire report from scratch at runtime based on the user's input. You'd have to have pretty intimate knowledge of the entire object model of the engine namespace, but it's definitely possible. So back to our original question, what happens when you drag the report document object onto your designer surface? Well, it creates an instance of the strongly typed report, and by strongly typed, again, we mean that the report file and the code behind already exist, and that there's public methods that are properties that allow you to access the various sections of the report and allow you to modify them as needed. And so from a practical standpoint, you can change just about any aspect of the report on the fly. So the documentation within VisualStudio.net is pretty helpful, but I found another very good reference for a visual object model for Crystal Reports, and I found that at this location. If you take a look at it, at the very end of the document in an appendix, it shows you, let's scroll up here, an object model for the report document. We can scroll in and take a look where you can get access to the set of tables that are referenced within the report document. You can obviously access any of the information about print options, about the report's actual definition, the areas, the sections, and other reporting objects, formula fields, group names, parameter fields, everything that you need to access. You can do this from the report document. And so I'd refer you to this as a pretty useful resource if you're going to do a lot of work with Crystal Reports and actually using the report document object. But remember that the report document object is really only half of the equation. The report document object allows you to work with the report and modify it, but then there's the other side of it, which is the actual viewer objects. And so with the viewer objects, when you're in code, you're able to actually use them to set the presentation details, the look, the feel, the size. Probably one of the more significant things that you can do is actually capture and handle events that are raised from the viewer objects. And again, I'll pop back over to this object model reference, because you can also view the Windows and Web Forms viewer object model and take a look at all the events that you can capture and handle, so you can have your own set of buttons or set of images that allow you to drill into a sub-report, to navigate, to search, to refresh the report, or to zoom into the report. So you don't have to accept the default look of Crystal Reports. You can customize it and make it look any way you want to using this object model. And you also use the viewer object to set secure database login information. I'll have a video about that in the future, so that you can request credentials from the end user to make sure that he or she has access to view that information. And then also you can prompt the user or hard code any parameters that are required by the report and pass those along as a request to the engine so that it can render the report properly. And again, for more information about the viewer object and the report document object, I'd refer you to that PDF file. One other quick note, this document in several places in documentation will say don't mix object models. There is some overlap in functionality between the viewer objects and the report document that allows you to modify various aspects of the report. They suggest that you choose to either do that in one or the other, but don't modify some of the properties of the report in the viewer objects and then some of the properties using the report document. They never exactly spell out why. I haven't tried it myself, but that might be sound advice if there's some sequence of events